welcome to Haunted Midnight. I upload true stories every week on my channel, so if you enjoy this video, check out my other videos. Before we begin, over 90% of you are not subscribed. It would be amazing if you guys can subscribe and support me, as I am still a small channel. Thank you for watching. I was itching for a break from the everyday chaos, so I decided to head out for a solo camping trip in a remote part of the woods that a friend had mentioned. I wasn't one for ghost stories or tall tales, but something about that area always gave me a shiver. I arrived late in the afternoon, the forest thick with an eerie kind of stillness, and the sky a fading mix of pink and gray. I set up my tent in a small clearing off an old, barely visible dirt road, choosing a spot that seemed safe enough away from any obvious animal trails. There was something almost unsettling about the silence that hung in the air, as if the forest was holding its breath and watching me. Once my tent was up, I built a modest fire and tried to relax with a book under the fading light. As dusk turned to night, the comforting sounds of nature I had always loved began to feel ominous. The steady crackle of the fire and the rustling leaves seemed to blend into an underlying hum of something unseen. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone or something was lurking just beyond the edge of the firelight. The shadows in the trees appeared to move with a life of their own, stretching and contracting in ways that made my skin crawl. It was around midnight that I first noticed the disturbance. I woke up to a soft, persistent rustling outside my tent, a sound that was too deliberate to be just the wind or a small animal. My heart pounded as I sat in the darkness, trying to listen to anything that could explain the noise. I slowly unzipped my tent a crack to peek outside, and what I saw made me freeze. There wasn't anyone clearly visible, but I could make out faint outlines among the trees. They weren't the silhouettes of animals I knew. There was something unnervingly human in their shape, yet not quite right. I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the moonlight, or if there really was a presence out there. The feeling of being watched was intense and immediate. I stayed huddled in my tent, every sound amplified in the oppressive darkness. The rustling grew closer, then paused, leaving a silence that was even more disturbing than the noise. I remember feeling completely exposed and vulnerable, as if every instinct in my body was screaming to run. Yet I was rooted to the spot by fear. The unease was so palpable that I could almost taste it. My thoughts raced as I tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was just a stray animal, or perhaps my imagination was running wild in the dark. But deep down, I knew this wasn't a simple case of overactive nerves. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I managed to drift into a light, fitful sleep that was punctuated by restless dreams. I woke up just before dawn with a lingering sense of dread. The fire had long since died out, and the remains of the logs were scattered around my campsite in a haphazard way that suggested deliberate disturbance, rather than the natural shift of wind. My personal belongings looked slightly displaced, as if someone had rifled through them. The realization hit me hard. Someone had been close, too close, during those long, terror-filled hours. In the weak pre-dawn light, I cautiously stepped outside my tent. The forest, usually full of life and promise, now felt like an alien landscape, filled with unfamiliar shapes and shadows. I noticed strange footprints in the damp soil, long, uneven tracks that didn't belong to any animal I could think of. They circled my tent and then vanished into the thicker part of the woods. The marks were deep and deliberate, as if made by someone dragging heavy steps through the ground. My mind spun with questions. Who could have been there? And more disturbingly, what had they been doing so close to me during the night? I gathered my things quickly and decided to leave the campsite while there was still a semblance of daylight. I took a different route from the one I'd come in on, trying to put distance between myself and whatever had been lurking around. Every step I took felt heavy, as if the forest itself was reluctant to let me go. The morning light did little to dispel the unease that had settled in my bones. The woods still seemed to whisper and murmur with secrets, each sound a reminder of that night's intrusion. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to catch a glimpse of those elusive shapes moving silently behind the trees. The drive home was a blur of anxious glances and racing thoughts. Every twist in the road, every shadow cast by passing trees, reminded me of that night and the inexplicable feeling of being watched. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined most of it, the rustling, the footprints, the strange disturbances, but deep down, I knew I wasn't lying to myself. I had felt it, experienced it firsthand, and it was as real as the dark sky above. The experience left a mark on me, one that has made it difficult to ever feel completely safe in the wilderness again. Even now, when I think back on that night, the memory is unsettling. I've been camping before and since, but nothing ever compares to that experience. I've heard other stories of strange occurrences in remote areas, but it always feels different when you've lived through it. I can't pinpoint exactly what it was, a ghost, a prowler, or perhaps a manifestation of my own fears. All I know is that something out there had taken a keen interest in my solitude, and that encounter left me with more questions than answers. The forest, with all its natural beauty, also harbors a darkness that is not easily understood or explained. There's no neat ending to the whole ordeal, no clear-cut resolution or moral to be learned. I simply left that forest that day, shaken and with a lingering wariness that I carry with me to this day. I never went back to that spot, and I rarely talk about it now, partly because it's too vivid, and partly because it still unsettles me. The memory of those heavy, deliberate footsteps in the night, the disturbing outlines seen in the moonlight, and the feeling of an unseen presence will always be a part of my past. I can't say what exactly happened, only that I experienced something profoundly unsettling that changed my relationship with nature forever. I remember the night vividly, each moment etched into my memory like a bad dream I can't fully erase. It wasn't just the fear of being alone in the wild. It was the overwhelming sense that the wilderness held secrets that were not meant for human eyes. Even in the safety of daylight, those secrets lingered, casting a long shadow over everything I did. I left the woods with a deep-seated awareness that nature is unpredictable, that it can be as dangerous as it is beautiful. There are parts of the forest I now view with a respectful distance, a quiet acknowledgement that some mysteries are best left unexplored. That camping trip was supposed to be a simple escape, a chance to reconnect with the peace of nature. Instead, it turned into an encounter that challenged my perceptions of reality and left me with a persistent feeling of dread. I haven't fully reconciled with what happened that night, and I'm not sure I ever will. The forest remains a place of both wonder and fear in my mind, a reminder that even in the most serene environments, there can be moments that disturb you to your core. I still don't have all the answers, but one thing is certain. That night in the woods was an experience I'll never forget, and it's a memory that continues to haunt me every time I hear the rustle of leaves in the dark. I had been itching for some solitude in the middle of nowhere, so I packed up my gear and drove to this remote clearing in the woods that I'd heard about from a friend. I wasn't one for ghost stories, but something about that spot always felt off, like the forest was keeping a secret. When I arrived, the place looked normal enough, a quiet clearing surrounded by thick trees, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves, and the distant hum of nature. I set up my tent on a small patch of ground that seemed clear of obvious animal trails, thinking I'd have a peaceful night under the stars. The first night started off uneventfully. I built a small fire, sat by it for a while, and enjoyed the crisp night air. The darkness felt heavy, but I chalked it up to the isolation and the unfamiliar surroundings. It wasn't until later that night that I began to notice little things that didn't fit. I remember hearing a soft, almost imperceptible rustling just outside my tent, like someone, or something, was moving slowly in the underbrush. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a deer or a small animal, but the sound felt too deliberate, too measured. When I woke up early the next morning, I decided to take a short walk around the campsite. As I wandered, I noticed strange footprints in the damp soil near where I had parked my backpack. They were too large to be from a deer, and their shape was oddly human-like yet not quite. The prints were spaced unevenly, as if whoever or whatever had made them was dragging themselves along in a peculiar manner. I bent down to examine them, my skin prickling with a mix of curiosity and unease. There was nothing else around, no signs of a campsite or any disturbance from other campers. Just those footprints leading off into the deeper part of the woods. Throughout the day, I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. I spent some time tidying up my gear and preparing a simple meal on a small portable stove, all the while feeling like I was being watched. I couldn't shake the nagging sensation that I wasn't alone, even though the forest should have been empty. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone lurking behind the trees, but every time I turned around, There was nothing there except the silent, towering pines. As night fell again, I sat by the dying embers of a small fire, hoping that the dark hours would pass quickly. But this second night proved far more unsettling than the first. The gentle murmurs I had dismissed before returned, now louder and accompanied by a slow, shuffling noise that made my heart pound. I remember the sound of branches snapping softly and leaves rustling, as if someone was carefully, deliberately walking in circles around my tent. I lay awake, paralyzed by a mix of fear and disbelief, unable to tell if what I was experiencing was real or just a product of my isolation and anxiety. I kept thinking back to the footprints I had seen that morning, wondering if they were connected to the noises I was hearing now. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a local who had a dark history with these woods, or maybe someone was deliberately toying with me. I tried to remain rational, telling myself that the forest was full of natural sounds and that my imagination was playing tricks in the dark. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the growing dread that each minor detail was building into something far more sinister. Around midnight, the disturbances reached a new level. I distinctly recall a moment when I felt a sudden drop in temperature, as if a cold presence had drifted over me. I opened my eyes just enough to see a dark shape moving between the trees, barely visible in the faint glow of the moon. The shape wasn't moving like an animal, nor did it seem to be merely a trick of the light. It moved with a slow, deliberate pace, almost as if it was stalking me. I couldn't tell if it was a person or something else entirely. My heart was racing, and I felt a surge of adrenaline that kept me awake, listening for any sign of movement. By the time the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon, I was exhausted from the sheer terror of the night. I didn't sleep much, but the break of day offered a temporary relief from the oppressive darkness that had enveloped me. I decided to inspect the area around my tent more carefully, trying to piece together any clues as to what had been haunting me through the night. I found that some of my personal items had been slightly moved. A flashlight that I had placed by the tent's entrance was now on the opposite side, and a small bag of snacks lay further away than where I had left it. These weren't things a curious animal would do. They seemed too calculated, too deliberate. The more I looked around, the more convinced I became that someone or something had been close by. I couldn't help but wonder if I had unknowingly stumbled into a situation that was far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. I spent the rest of the day gathering my thoughts, trying to rationalize the strange happenings by retracing my steps and re-examining the footprints I had found. I even considered the possibility that I might have been sleepwalking or hallucinating from exhaustion, but every piece of evidence seemed too real to dismiss as mere paranoia. Despite my growing fear, I tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, preparing a meager meal and doing some light hiking in the area. The forest during the day held no hints of the eerie presence that had dominated the night. The sunlight filtered through the trees, and the usual sounds of birds and insects seemed to drown out any memory of the prior horrors. However, every time I found a quiet moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I felt as though the forest was holding its breath, as if it was aware of the intrusion and was silently judging my every move. That second night, as the darkness descended once more, the unsettling events began again. I set up my camp in the same spot, not daring to move, even though every instinct told me to flee. I sat in my tent, listening intently to the symphony of nocturnal sounds, each one now carrying an undercurrent of menace. The low murmurs returned, softer this time but more insistent, like a secret being whispered right at the edge of my hearing. I could no longer ignore the possibility that I was being stalked by someone, or something, who knew exactly what I was doing. Every rustle and every creak seemed amplified in the oppressive silence of the night. By the time I finally managed to force myself into a restless sleep, I was overwhelmed by a cocktail of dread and confusion. I couldn't figure out whether these occurrences were the result of an actual intruder with a dark motive, a local with a troubled past, or simply the isolation making me hyper-aware of every tiny sound. There was no clear answer, and that ambiguity only heightened my anxiety. The subtle signs, the misplaced items, the strange footprints, and those chilling, indistinct murmurs had all added up to a haunting experience that I couldn't easily rationalize. When dawn broke the following morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to risk another night under those oppressive conditions. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my movements jerky and filled with an urgency I hadn't felt before. I left the campsite without a backward glance, the memories of that night seared into my mind. The journey back was a blur of anxious thoughts and a constant feeling of vulnerability, as if the forest had imprinted itself onto me, promising that I'd never feel truly safe again in its midst. I hadn't been back to that part of the woods since, and every time I venture into nature, I can't help but remember that remote campsite, where the line between reality and paranoia blurred in the dead of night. The experience didn't come with neat answers or a moral lesson. It was simply a series of small, inexplicable events that escalated into a night of terror. Even now, when I hear a faint rustle in the dark or see an unexpected footprint in a muddy trail, I can't help but recall the feeling of being watched in that quiet clearing. That camping trip was a stark reminder that sometimes the most disturbing horrors are not the ones with a clear identity, but the ones that lurk in the ambiguous shadows of the unknown. Looking back, I still question what was real and what was a trick of my mind fueled by isolation. The experience left me with more questions than answers, and while I try to rationalize it all, the memory of those unsettling nights remains vivid. There's no lesson learned or neat conclusion to this story. It's just a reminder that sometimes, being alone in the wilderness can lead to encounters that are both mysterious and profoundly disturbing. I went out for a solo hike a few weeks back, hoping to clear my head and enjoy some time alone in nature. I'd heard about a stretch of forest that wasn't on most maps, a place where the trees were older and the trails less trodden. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just a nice day among the pines. But as I wandered off the beaten path, I stumbled upon something that completely changed the course of my day. I found an abandoned campsite, hidden away in a small clearing deep in the forest. At first glance, it looked like a place where a group had once gathered for a weekend of camping, but everything was eerily still, as if time had frozen the moment they left. The tents were decaying, their fabric bleached and torn by the relentless passage of time. Scattered about were various belongings, a rusted can, a couple of old, faded sleeping bags, and even a few personal items that looked like they had been left behind in a hurry. There was an unsettling mix of neglect and abrupt departure that made me feel like I had stepped into a scene from a forgotten tragedy. As I moved closer, my eyes caught sight of several faded photographs lying on a flat rock. They were black and white images, showing smiling faces that now seemed ghostly in the dim light under the canopy. One picture in particular showed a group of people standing in front of a tent, their expressions full of hope and camaraderie. It was hard to imagine that the same spot could have witnessed something so joyful, only to be abandoned without a trace. Alongside the photographs were a few handwritten notes, their ink smudged and words barely legible, yet hinting at secrets and a deep sense of foreboding. I spent a long time examining every detail of the site. There were personal effects, a small dented compass, a pair of worn-out boots, and even a child's toy that looked out of place. But what struck me most were the cryptic symbols etched into the trunks of the trees surrounding the clearing. They weren't random carvings. They had a deliberate, almost ritualistic quality to them. I couldn't tell if they were meant to ward off something or serve as a marker for something darker. The whole scene felt like an unsolved puzzle, each clue beckoning me to uncover the story behind this forsaken spot. With my heart pounding and a mix of curiosity and dread in my gut, I decided to document everything I could. I took photos with my phone, even though I knew they wouldn't capture the full weight of the experience. I jotted down a few notes, trying to piece together a narrative of what might have happened here. It seemed like the people who once camped here had left in a rush. Maybe something had happened that forced them to abandon everything. The air itself felt heavy with the weight of their untold story. I left the clearing that afternoon with a strange feeling that I had just brushed against a hidden piece of history. But the mystery was too compelling to let go, so later that evening I headed to the nearest small town to see if I could find any clues. I visited a tiny library, one of those places that feels like it hasn't changed in decades, and began sifting through old newspapers and local records. There I found a few sparse reports about a group of campers who had disappeared nearly 40 years ago. The articles were short and vague, mentioning nothing more than that they were last seen near a remote spot in the woods, and that all attempts to locate them had failed. What caught my eye was a reference to unusual symbols reported by people who claimed to have seen them near the last known location of the missing campers. Armed with this new information, I returned to the town and tried to talk to some of the older residents. The recollections were hazy and wrapped in layers of local lore. I learned that there were whispers of a strange gathering in the forest, and some even hinted at a local curse that had claimed those unfortunate enough to wander too deep into the woods. While most of it sounded like the kind of stories you'd hear around a campfire, the details I discovered at the abandoned campsite made all feel disturbingly real. I wasn't sure if the symbols were connected to any ritual or if they were simply the desperate marks of people trying to communicate their fear, but it was clear that whatever had happened here left a mark that could not be easily erased by time. Back in my car that evening, I sat for a long while just trying to process everything. I kept replaying the images of the decaying tents, the faded photographs, and those inexplicable symbols etched into the trees. The feeling that I was intruding on someone else's long-forgotten nightmare was overwhelming. It wasn't just a matter of curiosity anymore. It felt like I had uncovered a secret that the forest had been guarding for decades. I couldn't help but wonder if the past was somehow repeating itself, if the same forces that once forced a group of campers to vanish might still be at work. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how fragile our understanding of history can be. What I had seen at that abandoned campsite was not just evidence of a long-ago tragedy. It was a reminder that places carry memories, whether we want to acknowledge them or not. The forest, with its quiet beauty and hidden depths, held on to the echoes of those who had once set foot there, their lives intertwined with the land in ways that were both poignant and mysterious. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed by the weight of that discovery. Every time I went for a hike, I found myself scanning the trees, half expecting to see the same symbols appear again, or even to catch a glimpse of a face from one of those faded photographs. I started to research more about the area and came across accounts of similar disappearances and eerie happenings. It was almost as if the forest had a way of repeating its own dark history, a cycle of loss that continued to haunt the present. I don't claim to have all the answers about what happened at that campsite, and I doubt I ever will. The pieces of the puzzle only seem to lead to more questions. Who were those people, and what drove them to abandon everything so abruptly? Were the symbols a warning, a remnant of a ritual, or something else entirely? The sense of mystery was as thick as the forest itself, leaving me with an unsettling mix of wonder and dread. I've often wondered if the forest holds a power that defies our understanding, a force that silently observes and perhaps even shapes the events that unfold beneath its ancient boughs. That abandoned campsite has stayed with me ever since, a quiet yet persistent reminder that not all secrets are meant to be solved. I still think about it when I'm alone in nature, feeling a chill that isn't entirely explained by the cold. The discovery changed the way I see the wilderness. It's no longer just a place to escape, but a repository of hidden histories and unsolved mysteries. And while I sometimes wish I could forget what I saw, I know that those images and feelings have become a part of me. I drove away from that part of the forest with more questions than answers, leaving behind a scene that seemed frozen in time yet vibrated with the energy of untold stories. The experience was raw and unsettling. It had also opened my eyes to the idea that the past isn't always confined to history books. Sometimes it lingers in forgotten places, waiting for someone to notice and remember. That day, I came face to face with a slice of history that was as tragic as it was mysterious, and it's something I'll carry with me for a long time. I'd been looking forward to a quiet escape into nature, so I set out on a solo camping trip deep in the woods a few months ago. I always loved the idea of spending a night under the stars, away from the constant buzz of everyday life, thinking that the isolation would be peaceful and even healing. I picked a spot that seemed safe enough, a little clearing surrounded by dense trees where I could see the sky and have some privacy. I spent the late afternoon setting up my tent and gathering a small pile of firewood. The day had been calm, and as night fell, I built a campfire and settled in, feeling content with the simple pleasure of being alone with nature. The first part of the night was everything I expected: warmth from the fire, the sound of crickets, and a gentle breeze that rustled through the leaves. I sat there, watching the flames dance, and lost track of time in a state of relaxed solitude. But as the night deepened, the atmosphere started to shift subtly. I noticed a soft rustling in the underbrush, something that didn't quite belong with the usual nocturnal sounds. At first, I convinced myself it was just a small animal foraging in the dark, but as the sound repeated itself, I began to feel a growing unease. The rustling was accompanied by intermittent footsteps that circled the area where my tent stood. I tried to remain calm, telling myself that a wandering animal or even a fellow camper might be nearby. Yet every crunch of twigs and every subtle movement of the leaves made my heart pound a little faster. I kept glancing around, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise, but the thick shadows of the forest made it almost impossible to see anything clearly. The initial comfort of the campfire began to feel like a feeble barrier against an unknown threat lurking just beyond the light. At some point during the night, I must have dozed off, lulled by the hypnotic crackling of the fire and the natural lullaby of the forest. I don't remember when I woke up, but I distinctly recall a cold sensation running down my back as I jerked upright in my sleeping bag. The campfire had dwindled into embers, and the darkness around me was deeper, more oppressive than before. I noticed that my tent had been disturbed. It wasn't in the same neat shape as I had left it. Some of my belongings were slightly out of place, and a few items that I distinctly remembered putting in one spot were now scattered around it as if someone had rifled through them. The feeling of vulnerability was overwhelming at that moment. I sat in silence, straining my ears to catch any hint of movement or sound. The forest, which earlier had felt like a comforting expanse, now seemed to close in on me with every passing minute. Every little sound became significant. A branch snapping in the distance, the soft murmur of what could have been a human voice carried by the wind, or the sound of my own pulse thundering in my ears. I felt as though I was not alone, and that someone or something was watching my every move from just beyond the reach of the dim light. I decided to check outside, though the idea of leaving the relative safety of my tent filled me with dread. I slowly unzipped the entrance and peered into the dark, cold night. The area immediately around the campsite looked almost unchanged, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. I took a few hesitant steps away from the tent, trying to follow the subtle signs of disturbance in the underbrush. The ground was uneven, and there were fresh indentations that looked like footsteps, circling the tent in an almost deliberate pattern. I couldn't tell if these were made by an animal or a human, but their presence deepened my anxiety. I started to move carefully, guided only by the faint light of a small headlamp I kept in my pocket. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing more of the forest than I had seen earlier, but it also seemed to cast more shadows, each one potentially hiding the unknown. Every rustle of leaves or distant crack of a branch had me stopping dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. I followed the trail of footprints as far as I dared, but they led me only to a thicker part of the woods where the trees grew so close that the sky was barely visible. There was no sign of a path or any clear indication of someone else's presence, just the oppressive feeling that I had been led astray. Eventually, the noises around me grew less frequent, and I was forced to retreat back to the safety of my tent. I returned with a sense of desperation and a mind racing with unanswerable questions. Was it an intruder, a person with ill intentions? Or perhaps it was an animal, but one that was far too cunning to simply wander by chance. The rational part of my brain tried to dismiss the fear as a product of an overactive imagination fueled by isolation. But the physical evidence, the disturbed tent, the scattered belongings, and those unmistakable footprints, told a different story. Back in my tent, I tried to secure the zipper and set up my sleeping bag again, all the while listening for any sound that might indicate the presence of someone else. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the night wore on, each minute stretching out in a relentless march of fear. I found myself calculating every noise, every shift in the dark, as if it might reveal the presence of that unknown observer. The sense of vulnerability was overwhelming, and I couldn't help but feel trapped, not by the physical confines of my tent, but by the realization that I might be in the middle of something much larger and more dangerous than I had ever anticipated. Time lost all meaning as I sat there, heart pounding and eyes straining to catch even the slightest movement in the dark. I considered the possibility of making a run for it at any moment, but the thought of stumbling blindly through the forest in the pitch-black night was equally terrifying. Instead, I huddled inside, every muscle tense with the need to be alert, every sense sharpened to the point of exhaustion. I tried to focus on the soft sound of my own breathing as a way to center myself, but it only reminded me of how alone I was in that vast, indifferent wilderness. As the hours slowly passed, the intense fear began to mix with a resigned sort of weariness. I couldn't decide whether to call out for help, even though I was too scared of drawing more attention to myself, or to wait out the night in silent terror. I eventually tried to get some sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I would wake up to a fresh noise, a branch snapping, the gentle scraping of something against the ground, or the distant sound of what might have been footsteps circling once more. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was actively watching me, as if it was keeping a silent score of my every fear. By the time the first hints of dawn began to break through the canopy, I was nearly in a state of shock. The night had felt endless, and every moment had been filled with a paralyzing mix of dread and uncertainty. I remained in my tent until there was enough light to see the area around me clearly, and that's when I noticed that the disturbances had not entirely ceased. The footprints were still there, etched into the soft earth, and my belongings still bore the marks of a thorough inspection. There was no sign of the intruder, no clear evidence of who or what had been prowling around my campsite, only the lingering, oppressive feeling of being hunted. As the daylight grew stronger, the forest slowly regained its usual calm. The earlier terror began to fade into a surreal memory, leaving me with more questions than answers. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my movements shaky from the adrenaline and exhaustion of the night. Driving back, I couldn't help but replay every moment in my head, every noise, every shadow, wondering if I had truly experienced an intrusion, or if the isolation of the wilderness had simply amplified my deepest fears. I haven't been back to that area since that night. The memory remains vivid, a stark reminder that even in the heart of nature, there can be moments when the world seems to turn against you. The night I spent in that remote part of the woods is something I will never forget. It was a night when every small sound, every rustle in the dark, was a potential threat, and when the sense of isolation morphed into a terrifying reality. There's no neat conclusion to what happened. It was just a series of unnerving events that built upon each other until I was forced to confront the possibility that I wasn't alone. I left with no clear answers, only the overwhelming feeling that sometimes, in the vast dark wilderness, the line between safety and terror is disturbingly thin. Story 5. I had been looking forward to a camping trip with a few of my closest friends, a chance to escape the daily grind and reconnect with nature. We were a mixed bunch, some of us skeptical about ghost stories, others more open to the strange legends that local residents whispered about. None of us really bought into the idea that the woods could be dangerous in any supernatural way. We all assumed those eerie tales were just local color, meant to keep people away from the more remote areas. That all changed in one unforgettable night. We drove out to a remote stretch of forest that the locals said had a history of unexplained events. Our plan was to set up camp near a small clearing by a creek, where the trees loomed high and thick, their branches casting long, deep shadows as dusk fell. The area seemed perfect, quiet, isolated, and full of natural beauty. We arrived in the late afternoon, unloaded our gear, and began setting up our tents with light-hearted banter. Even though some of us joked about the local legends, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease as I looked around. The forest had an oppressive silence that made every sound feel magnified. That first evening, we built a large campfire and gathered around it, trading stories and laughing as we poked fun at the ghost tales we had heard. The fire's warm glow pushed back the darkness, and for a few hours, everything felt normal. But as the night deepened and the flames dwindled into glowing embers, small disturbances began to make themselves known. I started noticing a soft rustling in the underbrush, a sound that seemed to echo just a bit too deliberately to be the wind or a stray animal. It wasn't long before I felt as though unseen eyes were watching us from the shadows beyond the firelight. I began to catch fleeting glimpses of movement, a dark shape shifting among the trees, barely visible when the light flickered. At first, we all assumed it was just our imaginations playing tricks on us in the dark. But then things escalated. I remember looking down and noticing that one of our backpacks, which I had been sure was securely tucked away, had been moved to a different spot. It was a small detail, but in the charged atmosphere of that night, it sent a chill through me. Later, I found footprints pressed into the soft earth near our tents, footprints that were too deliberate, too structured, to belong to any animal we knew. As the night wore on, the sense of dread grew. I found myself unable to relax, every small sound amplified into something sinister. While most of the group tried to shrug off the disturbances, a palpable tension started to ripple through our circle. We had all been joking earlier about the local legends, But now our laughter was replaced by worried glances and a heavy unspoken fear. The idea that someone, or something, was deliberately making us uneasy began to take hold, and the forest suddenly felt like hunting ground. The turning point came when one of my friends, James, inexplicably vanished from our side for a short time. We had all been sitting close together around the dying fire when he had simply not been there anymore. Panic set in as we searched the immediate area under the sparse light of our headlamps. James reappeared after what felt like an eternity, disoriented and muttering that he had followed a faint, almost otherworldly glow deeper into the woods. His explanation was hazy and didn't seem to fit with the rest of the night's events, but the fact that he'd been gone at all shattered any remaining sense of security among us. In the midst of our growing panic, we began to notice strange symbols carved into the trunks of trees near our campsite. The carvings were crude yet deliberate, a series of marks that seemed almost ritualistic. None of us could say what they meant, but the sight of them deep in the dark forest added a new, disturbing layer to our situation. It was as if the woods themselves were trying to tell us something, warning us of a presence that had been stalking us from the shadows all night. The initial skepticism we had held about the local legends was quickly giving way to a stark realization that these were not random coincidences but connected events. As the night dragged on, the dynamics within our group began to shift. Fear and suspicion crept in, and the friendly camaraderie we had enjoyed earlier started to crumble. Some of us began to question whether one of our own might be behind these unsettling happenings, a prank gone too far perhaps. But deep down, none of us could ignore the sense that there was something far more sinister at work. Each unexplained noise, every moved object and fresh footprint, piled onto our mounting terror, making it impossible to tell if our own minds were betraying us or if we were truly being hunted. I remember spending long, sleepless hours sitting away from the group, trying to make sense of the events as they unfolded. Every time I glanced out into the dark, dense forest, I felt the prickling sensation of being followed. The forest was alive in a way that night, its silence punctuated by mysterious sounds and the persistent feeling of being watched. Even as I tried to convince myself that we were all just caught up in a collective overreaction, the evidence in front of me was undeniable. The trail of fresh footprints, the altered campsite layout, and the inexplicable disappearance. All of it pointed to a presence that was orchestrating these events with a purpose. Dawn eventually crept in, its weak light doing little to dispel the lingering sense of dread that had taken root in our hearts. We gathered our gear in a subdued, anxious silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what had transpired during the long, terrifying night. The forest, which had seemed so inviting in the daylight, now looked ominous and foreboding, a place filled with secrets that were best left undiscovered. As we made our way back to the car, the events of that night replayed in my mind with relentless clarity. Every soft rustle, every carved symbol, and the inexplicable disappearance that had shattered our sense of safety. I still don't have a definitive explanation for what happened in those woods that night. There was no clear culprit, no singular moment that revealed the truth behind the series of encounters. All I know is that something was out there, methodically using the forest as its hunting ground, turning a simple camping trip into a nightmare of paranoia and fear. The once familiar forest had revealed a dark side, one that preyed on our deepest vulnerabilities and turned our skepticism into terror. That camping trip left an indelible mark on me, a haunting reminder that even the most skeptical minds can be shaken by the inexplicable. I left with more questions than answers, and the memory of that night continues to haunt my thoughts whenever I find myself in the quiet of the woods. There's no neat resolution, no comforting lesson to be drawn, just the stark reality that sometimes the most unsettling experiences come when you least expect them, in the depths of a dark forest where every shadow might hide a sinister secret.
Thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed this video, check out the video on screen.